Thank you, Alison, and good afternoon, everyone, in this very expert audience. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit about some of the very involved, you might say convoluted process that's being followed on developing this agenda, and then comment on some of the emerging themes around the debate. And also to thank ODI for being a great collaborator in all this, particularly around the virtual platform that's been created for the world's peoples who have access to social media and virtual platforms to have a say. It's so important in this to go beyond the normal suspects, governments, academics, experts. You know, what do the people think about this? I think that's incredibly important. So in the UK, obviously there's a high level of awareness that there's a high-level panel appointed by the Secretary-General, which is co-chaired by your own Prime Minister. A panel also drawing from ministers of government elsewhere, civil society, academics, private sector, etc. Due to report to the Secretary-General by the end of May. Just how it will report remains to be seen. How concrete will it be? Will it itself propose firm goals and targets? I think the thinking is perhaps not, but it may have things to say in an annex, yet to be seen. Also, there is the open working group of the General Assembly, mandated by Rio+20 in June last year. Appointed in January, rather large, I think about 70 people are appointed to take part in it, and as yet no co-chairs identified, I'm told, as I just specifically checked it. One of the issues, and I'll come back to this as I speak, is how to ensure that we don't have two totally different conversations here. One, a development poverty-focused conversation, and the other, an environment-focused conversation. I'm strongly in the camp that says we need to be thinking sustainable development, poverty eradication within the context of sustainable development, and we need the two teams to talk together and hopefully converge. Now, supporting all of this is quite a big UN operation, obviously across the agencies, funds and programs of the UN and the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. There's great interest and a lot of expertise. I have with me Paul Ladd, who's one of our key people. In fact, I might haul him up to help answer some of your points as I go along. This UN effort started with a task team on post-2015, which reported to the Secretary-General. That's all out on the web and available. But the UN Development Group, in support of the processes of the high-level panel and the open working group, is leading or facilitating these very, very extensive consultations at the country level, global thematic level, and supporting the online consultations. And again, I want to stress, going out beyond the expert audiences to groups that often struggle to be heard. I was looking at a piece from the Participate initiative of IDS online this morning, commenting on reaching the most vulnerable groups. And one of the points most vulnerable groups, marginalised groups, are making is don't tell us about aggregate progress on MDGs. It's not reflecting our reality. Disability groups have been particularly vocal and rightly vocal on that, feeling their issues are just hidden, inequalities are hidden in the averages, and I'll come back to that. And also some comment about form of engagement. People feel often you're given rigid questionnaires to respond to, but you need to tell your story in a way that doesn't always fit a rigid questionnaire. So I think we need to be very conscious of those kinds of points being made. There are, at the moment, national consultations facilitated by the UN in upwards of 70 countries. It could reach 100. There's been rather a lot of enthusiasm for having these national consultations, so as far as the money will go, we'll endeavour to support them. some of them quite innovative in form. Albania, for example, has been using Facebook to run consultations both on this and on its own national development agenda. So it's killing two birds with one stone, as it were. The global thematic consultations, I think the reports from these are really going to be quite interesting. We will, from UN Development Group, be publishing a sort of preliminary synthesis of what we've seen coming through in mid-March, and in a way my comments today will be sort of early comments on preliminary comments, but there's some interesting things coming through. And with the thematic exchanges, they're culminating not only with a global meeting, but actually preceded by an enormous amount of activity at a regional level and virtually moderated exchanges as well. When the UN Development Group endeavours itself to synthesise what's coming through all these discussions, it is also the intention to make available online all the data received and all the inputs, together with tools which people could use to analyse the data for themselves. In other words, you don't have to take our word for it. You can, if so minded, interpret the data for yourselves. Alongside those sets of consultations, you have the UN's Global Compact, which works with private sector doing its thing, and there's also a track Professor Jeffrey Sachs is doing with the global scientific community. Big issue will be, can all these tracks converge in one ambitious and bold global development agenda? And if we're thinking timing, I see a possible gap here that will need to be filled. You have a lot of activity in the national and global consultations coming to a head in the next few weeks and being reported on. You have the high-level panel reporting at the end of May to the Secretary-General. There'll undoubtedly be a focus at ECOSOC as well in July in Geneva. We move through the summer then and into the opening of the new session of the General Assembly with its high-level segment, and there's a high-level event on the MDGs, September 2013. There's then a year till September 2014 when the Open Working Group produces its report. And I think that's going to be a critical year for keeping the emphasis on bringing these tracks together. You know, in a sense, the development trackers will have had a very, very strong run, you know, right through late last year, this year, through to September 2013. But if the development people then went away and said, well, you know, it's now moving to the environment, I don't think that would be helpful. We have to get people talking across these communities. It's absolutely critical. So I think I'll certainly be talking with my own officials about how do we fill the gap between the two Septembers. Now, the thinking behind the process, I hate only talking about process, but process has a point, doesn't it? If you think of the last MDGs, they were delivered ex cathedra by coffee. That's not to say that they came out of thin air. They were well based in many important global conferences which had taken place prior to 2000. But in the end, the UN system delivered coffee a set of goals and targets, with an environmental pillar a bit of an add-on. And I think that's definitely has to be avoided this time. We need a properly integrated approach across the strands. The MDGs were seen as a roadmap for fulfilling the vision of the Millennium Declaration, which is a very fine document. I don't think we should attempt to it is in many ways the basis for the future we want. But there's no way, with the experience now of the MDGs and the level of engagement around it, the Secretary-General can go out and pronounce a set of goals and targets. Hence, this engagement, very, very large-scale engagement, in an endeavour to have an inclusive conservation and generate shared vision and ownership of that vision. Now, there's a second point too, I think, and that is, if we're looking at all this against the background of Rio+20, Sustainable development, the idea of sustainable development goals inevitably leads us rather more towards universal goals. And not just developing countries needing to reach certain benchmarks and indicators, but actually everybody having to reach some benchmarks and indicators. And for, quote, the future we want, a sustainable future, an awful lot of action is needed by rich countries on low carbon, climate resilient development. You know, we shouldn't think of this kind of development as only something that poor countries need to worry about. It's something we in rich countries need to be very, very worried and concerned about and planning for. So in this sense, we need to engage citizens the world over in what can this kind of agenda look like, and hopefully engage citizens to push their governments to be committed and constructive multilateralists. Might even produce some movement on climate negotiations if there was enough bubbling up from the citizenry. In the UN development system, obviously we have a great desire to build on what we see as the successes of the MDGs, and there have been successes. I mean, obviously not everything has succeeded. Some goals, like MDG 5, tragically have not seen anything like the movement one would have desired. On the other hand, you can't deny progress. In the health field, for example, interesting commentary in The Lancet in recent times by Chris Murray and co-authors on disability-adjusted life years, which points to the reductions in mortality in the areas targeted by the MDGs, infants and children under 5, maternal mortality to the extent there's been movement, HIV, AIDS, malaria goal. The drop in mortality from that, they attribute largely to the very high priority given and focus to action around the MDGs. So it no doubt in my mind the MDGs did direct resources and around clear priorities. What's coming out of all this? Well, I could say go to ODI's Future Development Goals Tracker, which is also a very useful online tool. And I think, Alison, you see the ideas, perspectives for goals, targets and indicators sort of piling up very, very high. And as I say, we will, from the UN Development Group, have a report out in mid-March. But perhaps some early observations. From the high-level panel meeting in Monrovia, what I read from the communique and the chatter is that there appears to be some convergence around the concept of the top priority to poverty eradication in the context of sustainable development, which is very consistent with Rio Plus 20's outcome, in seeing improving governance as a great contributor to achieving that, and seeing building resilience as critical to sustain the progress that countries make, rather than see it swept away by shock or adversity of whatever kind. In the thematic consultations, and I won't comment on all of them, there's been one around growth and employment, which seems to be trending towards seeing goals defined around jobs as an end objective, and inclusive growth as a means for that, but not just any old jobs. You know, the ILO didn't talk about decent work for nothing. It talked about decent work as the kind of work which could sustain people's well-being. And I think, Alison, as this institute's own research has pointed out, 1/3 of those who live in extreme poverty are in households where the head of household is in work. Just doesn't happen to be particularly remunerative or decent. So it follows from this that from this discussion is coming an emphasis on the quality of the jobs and the work and the livelihoods which people have. And the ILO is suggesting a two-pronged approach to reducing job vulnerability around respecting rules and regulations which guarantee the basic rights of workers, and they emphasise don't miss the specific needs and rights of women workers here, and also increasing support for micro-enterprises, SMEs, including in agriculture. The health consultation I've been taking some interest in because my own background as a Minister of Health many, many years ago, you can never leave health once you've been involved in it, and I end up speaking a bit on it at Harvard School of Public Health about a week back, and at the Lancet event yesterday, which I think was a very important event. So what do we see coming through here? I think it's important not to get trapped into an either-or debate about the health goals. The WHO has been leading on promoting universal health coverage as a prime goal and target. This has some opposition. I don't think we should choose between people having equitable access to services and, on the other hand, addressing the drivers of ill health. I think they're both important. Universal health coverage, what does it have going for it? Obviously, a right to care, an equity focus, which is extremely important. It could combine the concept of services for prevention and well health with acute illness services, and it avoids the verticality that we see in the current health goals. However, in my strong opinion, from decades of thinking about these things and developing strong opinions, it's not sufficient on its own. You have to address the drivers of ill health as well, across diseases. And there are many common drivers, not least poverty, but when one's thinking of the non-communicable diseases, which definitely need recognition in this agenda, not vertically, there's no point going out to tackle heart disease on its own, diabetes on its own, etc., but if we look at some of the key drivers which cause the most avoidable mortality, then you're looking at your tobaccos, your nutrition issues, your physical exercises. And there are some quite well-developed ideas for how you could get to the WHO agreed target now of a 25% reduction in mortality from NCDs by 2025. And there's almost a ready-made goal, if you like, to put into this particular discussion. On education, what's clearly coming through is the need to go beyond the emphasis on improving access to primary education. Of course, the job is not done there. Not every child's in school, far from every child finishes school, and the quality of education is often quite poor. There's some quite disturbing evidence now on how little many children are learning in the schools that they're in. So definitely people wanting to bring in the broader span of education. And let's, by the way, not neglect in our focus the most important years, which are the early childhood years, which tended to be a bit neglected. But quality is definitely an issue. And then, should there be some reflection on the acquisition of the skills, the competencies that people need to lead meaningful and productive lives. Governance. There has been a theme going on governance. Is governance a goal? Is it an enabler? Is it a means of implementation? A range of ideas coming through on that. If you were going to set indicators, what would they be? None of this is easy, and I don't propose to digress any more on it now. Also potentially quite politically controversial in the negotiating forum of the General Assembly. What do you do about MDG 8 and global partnerships? MDG 8, of course, has been much lambasted as vague and largely unsuccessful, although I think it is fair to note that the years from 2000 until very recently did see continual growth in official development assistance and did see some significant progress on debt reduction. So it's not all bad. But I think there is a perceived imbalance in the MDGs, that MDG 8 had delivery criteria for donors, and the rest of the MDGs had a lot of performance criteria for developing countries, and there seemed to be an imbalance in that, as there is. The UN task team, having a stab at a goal, around reinvigorating global partnerships for development. Thought that perhaps a degree of responsibility could be placed on every country for establishing a global environment conducive to sustainable development, and it might elaborate partnership responsibilities linked to each thematic goal, better connecting each goal with the means of achieving it. And that's been being discussed in a number of the thematic consultations in a way which sounds to me a little like policy coherence. You know, it's not just about development assistance, is it? It's about whether your migration policies, your trade policies, your tax haven policies, etc., 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 are also conducive to development. The UN task team, which did represent more than 60 system-wide agencies, including the Bank and the IMF, proposed building the future framework around 4 pillars: inclusive social development, inclusive economic development, environmental sustainability, it's the 3 strands if you like, and peace and security. Under those headings, it suggested including goals which finished the job on the MDGs, as clearly there's a job to be finished on eradicating extreme poverty, every child in school reaching much lower levels of maternal and child mortality, eradicating hunger, gender equality, but of course goals that reflect new challenges too. Projections show that in 2015 almost 1 billion people will be still living in extreme poverty. The target, after all, was to halve extreme poverty, which is great if you're in that half, but not so great if you're in the other half. And here's where I think this thematic discussion around inequalities is so important, because progress has been very uneven on the agenda that we've got. And you could say the agenda wasn't ambitious enough in any case, but even on it, it's been so uneven. And as I commented earlier, from some of the feedback through the Participate initiative of IDS, there is a strong feeling among disadvantaged groups that their story is hidden in aggregate achievement, that it is the way we report on MDGs disguises the very significant inequalities existing within countries. So, you know, how do you deal with this? How do you deal with the concept of equality and reducing inequalities in these goals? I think at the minimum level, we're going to need a much sharper focus on disaggregated data so the story can be told about what's happening. On gender equality is a thematic discussion, obviously very prominent, and many participating in the consultations feel that there should be both a specific goal on gender-based inequalities and that gender equality should be integrated through the whole framework. That again is going to mean a lot of disaggregation of data, and not all countries have a lot of disaggregation of data, even by gender, which is almost the most basic way of disaggregating data. Some are also advocating for specific reference to gender-based violence in the framework because of the significance of the problem worldwide and the very adverse impacts on human development. Interest in some thoughts on that. But, you know, let's come back in summary to where we want to go with this. I think it would be desirable to come out of it, to come out of high-level panel, all the global consultations, national consultations, thematic consultations, open working group, with a strong agenda that brings health and development together, education and development together, development environment together, and to get a clear global focus on what would really shift our world towards the kind of vision promoted in the Millennium Declaration and in the Rio outcome. And that's, it's going to need a lot of work to bring diverse actors and strands, let alone countries and geopolitics, together, but is surely worth the effort. And perhaps come back to the point that while the MDGs didn't come out of anything like this kind of exercise and process, they did succeed in directing resources into priority areas, and I think the evidence suggests getting more progress on human development in those areas than would otherwise have been the case. Now, if we can take the best of that and put in a very strong impetus on living within the boundaries set by nature, we could actually do a good job for people and our planet. I shall leave my comments at that.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much, Helen. Right.